Hi, my name is Elisabeth Gareis. I'm a professor of intercultural communication at Baruch College. My research focus is on intercultural friendship, specifically the friendship between international and domestic students at colleges and universities. I grew up in Germany and some time ago was an international student myself. As a so-called cultural seeker, I fully immersed myself in US culture and avoided too much contact with Germans and other internationals. But I noticed that international students often bonded more with each other than with Americans. They even disapproved of their compatriots hanging out with Americans. Many of the internationals I knew had no close American friends. The phenomenon intrigued me so much that I made it the topic of my dissertation. This was in the late 1980s. Despite the many benefits of intercultural friendship and a few decades later, unfortunately, the situation hasn't changed. Many international students still don't have meaningful intercultural contact with host nationals. That is, we're still not taking full advantage of the benefits that meaningful intercultural contact has to offer, and everyone is losing out as a result. This presentation will shed light on the intercultural friendship process and make some recommendations. There are 3 parts. Part 1 will focus on the internationalization of higher education and the benefits of intercultural friendship. In Part 2, I will discuss factors that influence intercultural friendship formation. I will focus on culture, language, and the international student experience. In Part 3, I will focus on factors related to the host environment and conclude with some recommendations. I have given this presentation at SVA twice in person to different groups. This online version is intended for SVA faculty. My hope is that the presentation will highlight how important meaningful intercultural contact is and how much international and domestic students can benefit. Part 1. Internationalization and benefits of intercultural friendships. The United States is the leading destination country for international students in the world. Enrollment is steadily climbing and has now reached the 1 million mark. Chinese students make up about 1/3 of all international students in the United States, and East Asians together about half of all international students. This shows SVA's international student enrollment in recent years. Undergraduate international students increased almost by 90% in 5 years, and graduate international students increased by 140% in 5 years. SVA's top countries of origin are similar to the US national trend. The top feeding countries are China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Canada, followed by India. East Asian students make up more than 60% of SVA's international students. It's fair to say that all of our institutions are internationalizing. They do so by making curricular changes, creating branch campuses abroad, offering study and internship abroad opportunities, and most of all, increasing international student enrollment. Especially the increase in international student enrollment pays off. The Chronicle of Higher Education has reported a clear link between international student enrollment and colleges exceeding their revenue goals. But numbers and revenue are so much on the forefront that recently critics have warned that we're losing track of the core rationale for internationalization. These critics are issuing calls for institutions to balance their financial and prestige goals with goals that focus on international goodwill. In September of 1945, Senator Fulbright introduced a bill in the US Congress to fund the promotion of international goodwill through the exchange of students. The principles were international partnership and mutual understanding. These principles are in direct correlation with the most often cited desirable outcomes of student exchange, which are engagement with global issues, knowledge about other cultures, interaction skills, preparation for joining the global workforce, and future international collaboration and networking. The question then is, How can we achieve these outcomes and foster international goodwill? To me, the answer is clear. We need to promote greater interaction between international students and host nationals. And more than that, we not only need to promote interaction, but encourage friendship. Here is why. If I could briefly bring in some theory. In 1954, Gordon Allport formulated his famous contact hypothesis. According to the hypothesis, there are 4 conditions for positive contact between groups of different cultural backgrounds. The first condition is equal status, meaning that if one wants to optimize intergroup contact, the members of the groups should have approximately equal status. The second condition is common goals. It helps, for example, if the 2 culturally different groups work on a common project. The third condition is no competition. So, if you're planning a soccer game, for instance, it would make more sense to mix the teams than to slate the culturally different groups against each other. The fourth condition is institutional support. This is the support provided by the administration for intercultural initiatives. Friendship meets all of these conditions. The contact hypothesis goes back to 1954. More recently, Thomas Pettigrew identified another factor, and that is long-term contact, as for example provided through friendship. Pettigrew determined that the potential for friendship is in fact an essential, not just facilitating condition of optimal intergroup contact, and as a result for reducing prejudice. Intercultural friendship can do even more than reduce prejudice. In international students, friendship with host nationals is also tied to stronger language skills, better academic performance, greater life satisfaction, lower levels of stress, a more positive mood, an enhanced perception of the host culture, and an enhanced image of the host institution. The latter 2, in turn, help promote the host country and institution when students return home and attract new students from abroad. And we should not forget, intercultural friendship also has benefits for domestic students. With only about 2% of American students studying overseas, intercultural friendship enhances the global perspective and improves the cross-cultural knowledge of domestic students. So you may ask, what's the problem? Well, study after study finds that many international students have little or no meaningful contact with host nationals. In a study I conducted in 2012 with 454 international students at various universities on the East Coast, 38% of the respondents had no American friends. When I differentiated between home region, the percentage was even higher for East Asians. 52% of East Asians, that's Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese, had no American friends, compared to 16% of Northern Europeans. This doesn't mean that the students had no friends at all, but their networks often consisted only of co-national and other international friends. In other words, their friends were students from their own country and other countries, but not the United States. These co-national and international friendships, of course, serve a purpose. They help students through culture shock and provide comfort away from home because of the shared experience. The problem is, however, that students who don't make host national friends are usually dissatisfied at the end of their sojourn. In fact, one of the uppermost complaints of international students is the lack of meaningful contact with host nationals. It also raises the question why we bring these students here in the first place if we don't do everything to facilitate meaningful interaction with Americans. It is through interaction that both international and domestic students can benefit most. To determine what can be done, we need to take a look at the factors influencing intercultural friendship formation. We'll do so in Part 2. Part 2. Factors influencing intercultural friendship formation. Intercultural friendship formation is influenced by a number of factors. They fall into 8 larger categories. Let's look at them and do so specifically with the East Asian students in mind. The first factor is cultural similarity. Cultural similarity provides what's called attributional confidence. That is, we can more easily predict and explain behaviors in people who are similar. This puts us at ease when we meet strangers from our own cultural group. For example, China and the United States are culturally very dissimilar, including in customs, communication style, and values. This makes it more difficult for US students to establish and maintain relationships with East Asian students than, for example, with North European students. Cultural knowledge on part of the international and domestic students can bridge this gap. Cultural knowledge can be increased through training workshops, books, classes, mentoring, buddy programs, and the like. The next factor is language proficiency. Language proficiency has been linked to both the international students' number of American friends and their satisfaction with these friendships. The students are aware of this connection. In a study I conducted in 2012, 78% of the Asian students blamed themselves for their lack of American friends, and most of them based this lack on their poor English. One has to keep in mind that English language education in countries like China and even Korea and Japan often focuses on written English and academic purposes. Any language class or workshop offered to students in the US should therefore include oral and colloquial communication needed for initiating, developing, and maintaining relationships. That would include lessons on self-disclosure, turn-taking, and humor, for example. Students should also be made aware of differences in friendship patterns between their home culture and the US. Most guidebooks to the US, for example, explain that American friendships are easily formed and often centered around activities and events. The guidebooks warn, however, that Americans may not want to get as deeply involved with other persons as is the case in some other cultures. That is, they warn international students that American friendships are not as deep and committed as elsewhere. These sentiments are echoed in interviews with international students about their friendship experience. Invariably, in research studies, students say the following about US friendship patterns. On the positive end, they say that Americans are friendly and open, that it's easy to initiate contact, and that the American term friend is broad. That is, it can mean anything from acquaintance to best friend. They also say that American friendships are based on having fun, but that one should not interpret friendly conversations as signs for a budding friendship. A little more negatively, students often comment that statements such as "I miss you" are not really meant literally, that it's difficult to form close friendships, that friendships don't last long, and that friendships are superficial and non-committal. To exemplify the last point, in one of my studies, a female Asian student wished that she and her American friend would talk more deeply from the heart. The students' comments are borne out by research. Friendships in the United States have been found high in spread and trust, but lower in duration and obligation than friendships in other cultures. Reasons for this are seen in the immigration history of the United States. Migration forces people to break ties with family and friends. In addition, the US has a high level of individualism and mobility. Obligation infringes on one's freedom, and if you move around a lot, attachments can get in the way or are difficult. Since differences in friendship patterns can be a big hurdle even for willing students, the topic of friendship should be part of any cultural orientation to the United States. We should make students aware of US friendship patterns to prevent misunderstandings and help students enjoy American friendships, no matter how different they are. The first 4 factors concern cultural and linguistic differences. The next 2 are more personal. As to motivation, when asked for the most important reason for studying in the US, most students say that they want to learn about people and culture, or that they want to improve their English language skills. We call these students cultural seekers. However, about 25% of students are not cultural seekers. They are task-oriented and focus almost exclusively on their studies. As such, They may not be highly motivated to make friends. Chinese students, especially those on scholarships, for example, tend to be more task-oriented than your typical cultural seekers from Europe. With Chinese culture being group-oriented and with other Chinese students being readily available in most host locations, the Chinese are also often quite happy in their Chinese peer groups. In a study conducted in New Zealand, for instance, Chinese students were the least likely international students to want New Zealand friends. Another study reports that Korean students at a large university in the Midwest had created an infrastructure that included all Korean childcare, medical care, and travel agencies. They rarely ventured outside of this network. It is these tight co-national groups that can give the impression to domestic students that international students are distant and self-excluding. This brings us to the next factor, cultural adjustment. After the initial temporary culture shock subsides, the question becomes how willing the students are to assimilate and how well they adjust in the long term. These are complex questions. To help them with these issues, it is beneficial to provide opportunities for discussion and counseling. This counseling should be framed and promoted in such a way that students from cultures where such assistance is not common feel comfortable to seek it out. The remaining two factors are related to the host environment. We'll cover them in Part 3. Part 3. Intercultural Friendship, Host Environment and Recommendations. Many of the factors influencing intercultural friendship formation focus on the cultural background and disposition of the students. But intercultural friendships are also helped or hindered by two factors in the host environment. The first of these factors is opportunity. We should ask ourselves what opportunities we provide that encourage integration and friendship development. We discourage interaction if the workload is too heavy, or as is the case in some science departments if lab teams are all Chinese or all Korean. The opportunities that encourage integration include mixed residential facilities, mixed orientation programs, teamwork in classes, extracurricular activities, and maybe also the encouragement of sojourns that last longer than, say, 4 weeks or a semester. The last factor is host receptivity. There are many questions. For example, are the hosts interested in making friends? At a commuter college, for example, American students likely have established networks and don't necessarily need new friends. Also, are ethnocentrism or even discrimination present? A student in New Zealand showed that the recent influx of Chinese students had caused fears of displacement of local culture. Neighborhoods had become more and more Chinese, and businesses catered to Chinese students. This resulted in hostile attitudes toward the Chinese on part of the New Zealanders. And a related question, how many international students are at your institution? It has been shown that with increasing density, international students perceive the campus as less supportive. This is likely because there is less individual attention for each student when the international student population is large. Another question focuses on location. Is the university located in a metro area? In my study from 2012, I compared 3 regions: Metro New York City, non-metro New York State, and the Southeast. Guess where students had most friendships with host nationals and were most satisfied? I found that Metro New York City received the lowest satisfaction score concerning friendships with Americans, followed by non-metro New York State and the non-metro Southeast. Some reasons for this finding are that metro areas not only attract educational tourists that may be more interested in the city's attractions than the people, and that they also tend to be more impersonal than smaller towns. Finally, do international students come from a high-status country? Sweden, for example, has relatively high status, which tends to make it easier for Swedes to find American friends than, say, for a student from Senegal. China's status is controversial. On one hand, there are reports of human rights violations, pollution, and government censorship. On the other hand, There is immense economic growth, and China has achieved superpower status. In this context, it's interesting to consider how stereotypes affect the status of international students. Rubel and Zhang studied the stereotypes that Americans have of Chinese international students. They surveyed 900 undergraduate students in the Midwest and found 5 stereotype clusters. The first stereotype is that Chinese are smart and hardworking. This reminds us, of course, of the model minority stereotype of Asian Americans. We need to be aware in this context that the pressure for Asian students to succeed comes at tremendous psychological and social costs. They often study harder and longer, forego a social life, and may therefore be lonely, alienated, depressed, and stressed out. Institutions have an obligation to provide support services and to educate faculty and staff about the potential damaging effect of the model minority stereotype. Stereotypes are often based on some kernel of truth. The second one, that Chinese are kind, friendly, nice, and polite, for example, is based on the Chinese cultural values of other orientation and respect. The third cluster of stereotypes claims that Chinese are bad at speaking English, are only friends with Chinese, are not well assimilated, and are socially awkward. This is a generally unfavorable stereotype, but some students in the study actually expressed empathy with the Chinese based on the stereotype and said they would reach out to them because of it. Next, Chinese are quiet, shy, loners, and not very social. This stereotype is especially pronounced for male Asians who are often portrayed in the media as isolated, effeminate, asexual, and culturally ignorant. Such stereotypes can become self-fulfilling prophecies and lead to male Asian students being perceived as invisible. A male Asian student in an interview I conducted broke my heart when he said, "I think Americans don't need to make Asian male friends." You probably remember a related news story in New York City. A Chinese-American student at Baruch College died in a hazing tragedy in 2013. There are few Asian American fraternities, but a disproportionately large number of hazing and drinking deaths in these fraternities. It has been suggested that the stereotype of Asian males as weak and physically inferior is to blame. That is, that Asian fraternities' hazing rituals are more severe, hypermasculine if you will, than those of other fraternities, to prove the stereotype wrong. The last stereotype is very unfavorable. The students in the study said Chinese are oblivious, loud, intrusive on personal space, conceited, annoying, strange, and do not care to adapt. This is possibly due to the large influx of Chinese students in recent years. The domestic students seem to have reacted to the greater Chinese density. This density also has the effect of Chinese students banding together more and experiencing less of a need to adapt to U.S. culture. So in short, the lack of integration of international students is often due to a combination of cultural and linguistic differences, lack of motivation and adjustment on part of the international students, lack of interest on part of domestic students, and institutional infrastructures that are not maximally conducive to integration. Any recommendations have to address these factors. For example, as to the latter point of institutional infrastructures, Lee and Rice, in an article entitled "Welcome to America?" go so far as to say that institutions undermine the international experience. The authors call for institutions to counter these infrastructural problems. So, what can we do to realize the enormous potential of international exchange, a potential for both international and domestic students? The European Association for International Education, the EAIE, has created an International Student Mobility Charter, and it calls on governments and education institutions to endorse, support, and promote 11 principles. 3 of these principles relate to the topic of international student integration. First, intercultural competence of faculty and staff. This competence includes the recognition of one's own cultural perspective, an awareness and respect for other perspectives, and the ability to communicate successfully across cultural difference. Second, intercultural competence of students. International students should be given intercultural preparation, have access to advice on intercultural awareness while in the country, and get support with reintegration when they return home. Third, integration of international students. I quote from the Charter: "When admitted to an education institution, international students are automatically also admitted to a country, a new community, and its different culture. International students' integration and interaction with the academic as well as the wider community needs to be actively facilitated to maximize the value for all stakeholders. We can actively facilitate integration by providing an infrastructure that promotes contact. Some infrastructural elements that promote contact are cultural and linguistic orientations, extracurricular bonding activities, for example, socials, dinners, and dances, mingling and showcasing events, for example, international coffee hours or tango night, buddy programs, including conversation partner programs and programs that pair returning American study abroad students with incoming international students, student clubs conducive to mingling and gathering places throughout the campus, holiday activities, mixed residential facilities, in-class teamwork in mixed groups with rotating leadership, including international students as team leaders, counseling services, and centrally posted information on all services and activities. Because East Asians are group-oriented, it is advisable to get Asian student leaders involved in the planning of intercultural events, so that their social influence will encourage their Asian peers to participate. SVA already engages in some of these activities to promote the integration of international students and U.S. domestic students. For example, the International Student Office provides a comprehensive orientation program held simultaneously with U.S. domestic students during Orientation Week, the Cultural Partner Program, which is a cohort of students who meet monthly for group discussions, social gatherings, and community service, and celebrations of cultural events on campus, such as the Lunar New Year and Mid-Autumn Festival. The Office of Student Affairs provides student clubs and mixed residential facilities. Plus, more international students are becoming orientation leaders and resident assistants. The international students also utilize the counseling services to the same degree as U.S. domestic students. There is one more unexpected measure institutions can take to promote contact. Weinstein, Brzebilski, and Ryan found that immersion in nature elicits pro-social and other focused value orientations. In their study, after experiencing as little as 8 minutes of nature, the company of people and relationships became markedly more important to the subjects of the study than before. Institutions would therefore do well to consider creating spaces with nature where students can meet. This concludes the screencast series on intercultural friendship. I hope you have enjoyed it. For more information, including a list of the studies I cited, please contact me anytime. I can be contacted through the International Student Office. The ISO also welcomes feedback and input from SVA faculty. Goodbye.